The night the storm came, I realized silence could be louder than thunder. Rain slammed against the windows of my house on Greenwood Avenue, a steady rhythm that felt like someone knocking from the outside, impatient, demanding. My head still pulsed from the stroke 2 weeks ago. I should have been in bed. But something, a sound, a feeling, pulled me out into the hallway. That's when I heard them. At first, just murmurs, then words, clear, sharp, and cruel enough to cut through the rain. If he passes soon, we'll finally have the house. The whole thing. Grace, my daughter-in-law. The same woman who kissed my cheek every Sunday and called me Dad. Her voice had a sweetness to it, the kind that leaves a sting after the sugar melts away. And then another voice, one I knew by heart. Make it look natural, Helen said. He's already half gone. My wife. The woman I built this home with, brick by brick, now planning how to live in it without me. I stood there, behind the half-closed door, my hand gripping the cold oak railing. The hallway smelled of polish and rain seeping through the old roof. The scent of a house pretending to be whole while everything inside it cracked. I wanted to step in, to ask them why, but the words stuck in my throat like dust. Instead, I listened. The sound of a spoon tapping a crystal glass, the faint laugh that followed. Each note sank into me like a nail. Maybe this is what family drama really is. Not the shouting, not the fights, but the quiet rehearsals of betrayal done behind closed doors. My heart thudded unevenly. I pressed my palm against my chest and looked at the portraits on the wall. Helen, Ethan, Grace, and me, all smiling as if nothing could touch us. The perfect family framed in lies. Outside, lightning flashed, turning the hallway white for a second. In that brief light, I saw everything differently. The rug Helen picked last spring. The crack in the ceiling I never fixed. The photo of Ethan at his college graduation. Every object suddenly became evidence, proof of how far love can fall before it shatters. Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. The clock struck 11:47 p.m. I felt it vibrate in my bones. The sound echoed through the house like a judge's gavel. That night, I understood something I never wanted to know. Sometimes the people waiting for your recovery are the same ones counting down your final breath. And as I stood there in the dark, with thunder rolling over the city, and my pulse fading into the storm, a thought came so quietly it almost felt borrowed from someone else's mouth. When did my family start rehearsing my funeral? The second week after the stroke, I stopped pretending to heal. Instead, I began pretending to fall apart. The house on Greenwood Avenue had turned into a museum of sympathy. Flowers on every table, cards lined up like gravestones, whispers in every room. I sat by the window in my study, stirring a bowl of soup until it spilled onto my shirt. The stain spread slowly, like a map of surrender. Lydia, the young nurse they hired from Harbor Care, walked in with her clipboard pressed to her chest. "Mr. Avery, do you remember what day it is?" she asked gently. "The day my name started to fade from their mouths," I said, still staring out the window. She hesitated. "You're getting stronger," I smiled faintly. Stronger doesn't always mean safer. Down the hall, I heard Ethan's voice. Low, tired, practical. $8,000 this month, Helen? Insurance won't cover all of it. We can't keep doing this. My wife sighed, a sound more like annoyance than worry. It's temporary. Once the paperwork clears, things will change. Paperwork. Always paperwork. In my world, blueprints and contracts had built towers. Now they were digging my grave. I took the tiny white pills Lydia placed on the tray. $120 a box, the label read. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was paying for the illusion of decay. Every evening, after they thought I had drifted off, I listened. The way Grace's heels clicked on the hardwood floor when she visited. The hushed exchanges about, "What's best for Dad?" Their words were knives wrapped in concern. Sometimes I muttered nonsense. Angles, roof pitches, load ratios, architectural fragments from a life where logic mattered. It made them believe the fog had settled in my brain. But behind every incoherent mumble, I was building something new. A plan, invisible yet exact. The nights were the hardest. The old clock in the hallway ticked like a heartbeat I no longer trusted. I'd watch Lydia fold my blanket and wonder if she saw through me. One night, she paused at the door. "You're not like my other patients," she said quietly. "You listen too carefully." I met her eyes. "And what do you think I'm listening for?" She didn't answer, just turned off the light. The silence that followed was heavier than any reply. When everyone slept, I stood before the mirror. My reflection looked unmoored, unshaven, pale, but the eyes still sharp. A man halfway between the living and the gone. The perfect disguise. They wanted a helpless father, a fading mind, someone easy to move aside. Fine. Let them believe that story. Every family has one. A quiet performance of weakness hiding the architecture of resolve beneath it. If deceit was their design, then I would master the blueprint. I looked down at my trembling hands, then let the spoon clatter to the floor, echoing through the empty room like a declaration. If they wanted a fool, I'd be their masterpiece. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so others can watch too. The morning light in my study fell across the papers like a confession waiting to be signed. Dust hung in the air, soft and weightless, the way lies often are before they land. I had not been in this room for weeks, at least not officially. The smell of ink and cedar was still there, mixed with something sharper. Distrust. Martin Keene arrived at precisely 9:00 a.m., his shoes too polished for this kind of weather. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavier than it should. I watched him from my chair, blanket folded across my knees, a performance of frailty I'd learned too well. "Thomas," he said with that lawyer's tone, half sympathy, half strategy. "It's just a technical adjustment. The trust division needs clarity, standard practice after medical events." I looked at him for a moment, then let my hand tremble as I lifted the pen. "Whose hand will hold the pen when I can't?" I asked. He smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "That's what this is for." The papers were laid out neatly. 6 pages. Legalese printed in 12-point Times New Roman, every word measured to the ounce, designed to sound like protection while hiding a wound beneath it. Grace had insisted Martin handle everything. "He's family," she'd said once. But family, I've learned, isn't always who stands beside your bed. It's who profits when you stop breathing. As I lowered the pen, my fingers slipped. The ink line streaked across the margin, an ugly scar on clean paper. I apologized, voice low. "Hands don't work like they used to." "That's all right," Martin said quickly. "We'll sort it out later." He folded the page before I could see what I'd signed. He didn't notice the small lens tucked inside the wooden frame behind my desk, the one disguised as an antique compass. It blinked once, recording everything. When he stepped outside to take a call, I heard his voice through the half-open door. "Yes, it's done. He signed. No, he didn't notice." A pause. Then quieter. "We'll discuss payment later, Grace." The words hit like cold water. I stared at the documents in front of me. The edges glowed under the morning light, a perfect halo for something that reeked of deceit. I let my head sink back into the chair and pretended to sleep. When Martin returned, he found me half asleep, eyes dull, pen fallen to the carpet. "You should rest," he said softly. I murmured something that sounded like thanks. Inside, I was calculating. Every visit, every transaction, every false kindness. My life had turned into an audit of faith. That night, when everyone had gone, I replayed the recording on a small monitor hidden behind a bookshelf. Martin's voice was clear. Grace's name was clear. And suddenly, the line between loyalty and survival blurred into something darker. Even the spider, I thought, doesn't know it's trapped in another web. Grace came to the house early that morning, her perfume arriving a few seconds before she did. The sound of her heels echoed through the hallway. Confident, impatient, the rhythm of someone who believed the stage now belonged to her. She didn't knock on my study door. She just walked in. Boxes, labels, the smell of cardboard and lemon cleaner. My office, the one room in the house that still felt like mine, had become her project. "You've had your time, Thomas," she said, stacking my old blueprints into a crate marked donation. "The future doesn't belong to the past." I watched her hands move, quick, precise, the same way she used to arrange flowers for Sunday dinners, except now she was arranging my disappearance. I took a slow breath. "Then pray the past never remembers you." She froze for a second, just long enough for me to see the flicker of irritation behind her smile. Then she bent down, picked up a photograph from my desk. Me, Ethan, and Helen, standing in front of the company's first completed project, the Hillcrest Apartments, 1997. She looked at it as if it were a relic from a religion she no longer believed in. "You should rest," she said finally. "Let us take care of things now." I smiled faintly. "You already are." After she left, I sat there staring at the boxes. My life, reduced to inventory. Plans worth millions now folded like old newspapers. In her world, what wasn't profitable was disposable. That afternoon, Lydia came in with a tray of tea. She hesitated when she saw the state of the room. "They're clearing out your work?" "Looks that way." She put the tray down, her voice softer. "It doesn't seem right. You built this company." "Built it, yes," I said. "But I made one mistake. I taught them how." Later that night, I noticed a transfer alert on the shared family account. 200,000 moved at 8:43 p.m. Description, maintenance funds. No signature. No authorization from me. Grace's fingerprints were all over it, even if the system couldn't see them. When Lydia came to tidy the desk the next morning, she glanced at my laptop screen and frowned. $200,000? I nodded. A good start for a new empire. She looked at me, confusion tightening her brow. "You're letting them?" "I'm letting them believe I'm too weak to notice," I said. "Sometimes the best way to see what's underneath is to let the mask slip on its own." There was a silence between us. Not awkward, just heavy, like the pause before a storm breaks. I could tell she wanted to ask more, but didn't. In the days that followed, Grace's visits became more frequent, her tone more commanding. She spoke to the contractors about new projects, signed documents under Ethan's name, and erased mine from the company's records. Even Helen began calling her the one keeping things together. But control is a fragile thing. It always cracks under its own arrogance. One evening, I walked past the office door and caught Grace whispering into her phone. "Yes, it's done. He's fading faster than expected." Her voice was low, careful, but the greed in it was unmistakable. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Every lie needs its own echo before it collapses. When she left, I went inside the study. The moonlight fell across the empty shelves, and the air smelled faintly of her perfume. Lavender and something metallic beneath it. I stood there, alone, surrounded by silence and dust, and realized something simple but sharp. Every performance, no matter how convincing, requires an audience. And I wasn't done watching. Even lies need witnesses. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so others can watch too. It was midnight when I finally did it. The storm had passed, leaving the house wrapped in a kind of uneasy quiet, the kind that follows a truth no one has spoken yet. I took the small black camera from the drawer, a device no bigger than a matchbox, bought anonymously under a false name. I placed it behind the wedding portrait, the one Helen insisted we keep over the fireplace, where our smiles had been frozen since 1984. The frame was heavy, oak and glass, our faces forever young, unaware of the fault lines time would carve through us. The lens blinked red once, almost like a heartbeat. It caught my reflection in the glass. A man not dying, but disappearing by choice. During the day, the house moved in rhythms I no longer belonged to. Grace's voice echoed through the halls, steady and strategic. Ethan followed her cues, nodding more than speaking, like a man who'd traded his conscience for comfort. I spent my mornings in the study, pretending to nap while the camera watched what I could not. One afternoon, Grace stood near the window, whispering into her phone. "He's getting worse," she said. "The doctor thinks his mind's gone. It won't be long now." Her tone was soft, almost compassionate, the kind of compassion that's measured in policy payouts and signed forms. I leaned back in my chair, eyes half closed. "How strange," I murmured, "that death brings out the best in people." The camera light blinked, catching every word, every tilt of her lips as she smiled and said, "Yes, I'll handle the lawyer." When she left, I rewound the footage. Watching it felt like standing outside my own life. Detached, cold, analytical. The way I used to study blueprints, tracing every flaw before a wall collapsed. That night, I sat by the window, notebook open, listing timestamps, voices, gestures. Evidence wasn't just what they said. It was the tone, the timing, the way the light flickered when someone lied. I'd spent my life building structures. Now I was dismantling one. The next morning, Lydia came in earlier than usual. She opened the curtains and stopped. "That photo," she said softly, looking at the portrait. "Didn't it used to hang higher?" For a second, I froze. "Maybe it shifted," I said, too quickly. She tilted her head. "You've been moving things lately." I smiled. "Only the pieces that matter." She lingered, as if sensing something she couldn't yet name. Then, with quiet understanding, she said, "Whatever you're doing, Mr. Avery, be careful. Some people fear truth more than death." Our eyes met, hers calm, mine tired. I realized then she had seen the camera. She said nothing more. When she left, I exhaled slowly. The air in the room felt lighter, cleaner, as if someone else finally knew the weight I was carrying. Down the hall, Grace laughed at something on her phone, a sound as bright as glass breaking. I turned toward the portrait, the red light steady and patient. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. Sometimes the only ally you have is the silence that sees. The dining room looked like a magazine spread that had aged in the attic. Candlelight glinting off silverware, the smell of roasted lamb mixing with fresh roses Grace had ordered that morning. She always loved appearances. So did Helen. Between the two of them, even the dinner table was performing. I sat at the head, where I used to belong, hands steady on the fork, though I made sure they looked frail enough to tremble. Ethan poured wine with the care of a man trying to avoid an argument, not a spill. The clock on the wall ticked, patient and judgmental, as if waiting for the first lie to be served. "Dad," Ethan said finally, clearing his throat, "maybe it's time you rest. You've done enough." I looked at him, at his cautious eyes. Eyes that used to look for approval, now looking for permission. "A man rests when he's buried, son," I said, smiling faintly. "Until then, he eats what's in front of him." Grace gave a small laugh, the polite kind you give at funerals. "Let's not talk about work or anything heavy tonight. We all deserve peace, don't we?" "Peace?" I said, slicing through my lamb. "Strange word. Usually comes right after war." She lifted her glass, ignoring the jab. "To new beginnings." I raised mine too. "Or old endings." Ethan chuckled nervously, the way someone does when they hope laughter can glue together what's already cracked. Helen reached for the salt, avoiding my eyes. She had perfected that art, pretending not to see the things that stared straight at her. The meal went on. Grace talked about expansion projects for Avery and Sons, now just Avery Construction on the business card. The way she said it, my name was already gone, like the first draft of a speech no one remembered. She had ideas, of course. Bigger clients, luxury developments, new investors. The kind of talk that made Ethan's face glow and my stomach turn. "Your father's proud," Helen said, her voice too light to be true. I smiled. "Am I?" The silence that followed was long enough to count by heartbeat. I took another sip of wine, sweet and sharp, a perfect metaphor for the company around me. When Grace's phone buzzed, she excused herself. "Work," she said, already walking away. The red light from the camera hidden in the corner of the chandelier flickered once. I watched her step out to the hallway, her voice low, urgent, the kind of tone people use when they think no one's listening. "Yes," she whispered. "He looks worse. Another week, maybe 2. Ethan poked at his food, avoiding my gaze. I leaned back, the chair creaking softly beneath me. "You hear that, son?" I said, half laughing. "It's good to know I'm on a schedule." He froze, then gave that same forced chuckle. "She didn't mean it that way, Dad." "Oh, I think she did. She just meant it efficiently." Helen set down her fork, her hand trembling slightly. "Thomas, please." I looked at her, the woman who had shared my life, my bed, my name, and wondered when she had stopped sharing the truth. The candles flickered, as if the air itself held its breath. Grace reappeared, her phone tucked away, her smile perfectly restored. "Sorry about that," she said sweetly. "Business never sleeps." "Neither do ghosts," I said. For a brief second, something in her eyes shifted. A crack in the mask, just wide enough for the truth to peer through. Then she laughed again, too loud, and poured more wine into my glass. When dinner ended, the plates were spotless, but no one felt full. They left the table one by one, the way mourners leave a grave before the dirt hits the coffin. I sat alone, staring at the last drop of wine swirling in my glass. It caught the light, deep red, beautiful, dangerous, a mirror of what we'd become. Every toast has poison, only the brave keep sipping. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so others can watch too. It was 2:03 a.m. when the monitor blinked awake. The house, so grand by day, looked skeletal under the infrared glow. Its hallways stretched long and empty, the walls thin enough to hold a secret but never strong enough to keep one. I watched the grainy feed in silence. Then movement. The door to my study creaked open. Grace stepped inside, her figure outlined in silver light. She was barefoot, careful, her breath shallow enough to fog the camera only for a second. She went straight for the safe, the same one she had once teased me about. "Why keep paper in a digital world?" she'd said, laughing as if the thought of theft were ridiculous. I suppose irony has a sense of humor, too. I turned the monitor volume up. Her whisper was almost tender. "Come on, come on." The metal dial clicked softly, her hands steady, practiced. I stepped into the doorway before she could open it. "Couldn't sleep, Grace?" She froze. The flashlight in her hand fell, rolling across the carpet. Her eyes widened, her mouth a trembling shape. You were supposed to be in bed!" "So were your lies," I said. For a moment we just stood there, 2 actors realizing the audience has arrived too early. "I was just," she began. "Don't," I cut her off. "You'll insult us both." The tension in the air was almost comic. She glanced toward the camera without realizing it, her instinct pulling her gaze toward guilt. I followed it. "Ah," I said softly. "So you do know about the eyes in this house." Her tone cracked, desperate now. "You don't understand, Thomas. I was only trying to protect Ethan." "By emptying my safe? That's a new kind of love." She stepped back, bumping into the desk. The drawer rattled. For a second I thought she might cry, but instead she smiled, a strange, brittle smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You think you're the only one watching?" I tilted my head. "Meaning?" She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. The screen glowed faintly. An active voice recorder. "Insurance," she said. "For everyone." I laughed quietly. "You're recording me while I record you. Perfect. We've turned honesty into an arms race." Her face flushed. "You don't know what it's been like." "Save it," I said. "It's not the papers I care about. It's the face you wear when you think I'm gone." For a long second, she stood still. Then she took a step toward me, maybe to explain, maybe to strike back. But her heel caught the edge of the rug. The phone slipped from her hand, landing with a sharp crack. The recording light blinked twice, then died. The silence that followed was immense, filled only by the faint ticking of the wall clock. 2:14 a.m. Time moved on, indifferent as ever. Grace knelt down to grab the phone, her composure collapsing with it. You can't prove anything, she whispered. I crouched beside her, voice calm. Maybe not tonight, but truth doesn't vanish just because you delete it. Her eyes glimmered with fury, or fear. Sometimes the two look the same. She stood and stormed past me, her perfume leaving a trail that smelled of lilacs and guilt. When the echo of her footsteps faded, I turned back to the monitor. Both recordings, hers and mine, captured the moment we tried to outplay each other. The only question was which story would survive the edit. In a house full of mirrors, who's truly watching who? Morning light has a cruel way of making everything look cleaner than it really is. The Avery dining room glowed in it, polished wood, fresh coffee, and the illusion of civility. They all sat where they always did, Helen at the far end, Ethan checking his watch, Grace pretending to care about the toast she wasn't eating. I placed the laptop on the table. No introductions, no warnings, just one click. The footage began to play, grainy black and white, time-stamped 2:03 a.m. Grace's voice filled the silence. He's getting worse, she whispered, bending over the safe. Then came my voice from the doorway. Couldn't sleep, Grace? Helen gasped. Ethan's fork clattered against the plate. Grace's face drained of color before she collapsed onto the chair, her hand pressed against her chest like a bad actress in a community theater tragedy. I let the recording play a few seconds longer. The sound of her own voice echoing in the room was more effective than any sermon. Then I spoke. I didn't lose my mind, I said evenly. I lent it to see what you'd do with it. Ethan tried to speak. Dad, I didn't mean to. You meant every silence, I interrupted. He looked down, eyes wet, but the guilt wasn't new. It had been there for months, hiding behind every polite nod, every empty, "How are you feeling?" Helen started to cry. Real tears this time. She whispered, "Thomas, please, let's stop this. We can fix it." I turned to her, the woman I once thought would outlive every storm beside me. "We can't fix what you didn't fight for." Grace stirred, finally finding her voice. "You think this will make you some kind of hero? You'll ruin us all." I smiled. "No, Grace, you did that already." The air grew thick, the kind that makes breathing feel like betrayal. Ethan stood up, pacing. "We can make it right, Dad. Just tell me what to do." "You start," I said quietly, "by learning the difference between love and obedience." Then, as if summoned by guilt itself, the front door opened. Martin Keene stepped in, tie loosened, the smell of aftershave and desperation following him. "Thomas," he said, voice too casual, "I think we should talk privately." I raised an eyebrow. "About what?" He hesitated. "About resolving things. You release the recordings, no one wins. But if we can reach an arrangement, I can make all this disappear." "How much?" I asked. 200,000, he said quickly. "Enough to keep it quiet. You'll get peace. They'll get distance." I almost laughed. Peace bought by price tags. That's poetic. I leaned back in my chair. "I've already paid the price, with my family's soul." Martin's expression shifted. Not anger, not pity, just the realization that his offer was too late. He left without another word. The silence that followed was absolute. Grace sat with her head in her hands. Ethan stared at the floor. Helen wiped her eyes with the edge of the napkin that had once been folded in love. I closed the laptop. "You wanted a life without me," I said softly. "Now you have it." When I stood up, no one tried to stop me. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells from down the street. Funny how forgiveness always rings too late. Justice doesn't always come from the law. Sometimes it comes from loss. If you found this video helpful, please subscribe to the channel, like it, and share it so others can watch too. The pen felt heavier than I remembered. Maybe because it wasn't just ink I was signing with this time. It was the last of my faith in the people who shared my name. The house was quieter now. No whispers behind doors. No staged compassion. Just the soft hum of the ceiling fan and the scratch of my pen against paper. Lydia stood near the window, pretending not to watch, though she knew exactly what this was. The new document lay before me. 6 pages, notarized, final. I'd read it 3 times, not because I doubted the math, but because I wanted to make sure there was nothing left to misunderstand. Everything, the properties, the stocks, the accounts, was being transferred to a new entity. The Avery Foundation for Young Designers. $5 million to fund architects who still believed design could build more than walls. I'd built towers once. Now I was building a truth they couldn't demolish. Ethan arrived just as I sealed the last envelope. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe guilt had a way of shrinking people. "Dad," he said, his voice already unsteady. "Grace left. She packed everything this morning. Didn't even say goodbye." "I doubt she had anything left worth saying," I replied. He sank into the chair across from me, eyes red. "I don't know what to do anymore." I slid a single envelope toward him. "Then start with this." He frowned, opening it slowly. Inside was a letter. 1 sentence, handwritten in the same ink that had built this family's empire. "Here's the last thing your mother and Grace taught me. Value isn't in money, it's in memory." He looked up at me, tears breaking quietly. "You're giving it all away?" "I'm returning it," I said, "to where it might still do good. Money was never the problem, Ethan. It was the mirror we refused to look into." He nodded, though I could see the storm in his chest. I didn't comfort him. Sometimes love isn't a hand on the shoulder. It's a lesson carved deep enough to scar. When he left, the air felt strangely lighter, like a room after someone finally opens a window that's been sealed too long. Lydia stepped forward, holding her small leather notebook. "The foundation paperwork's ready," she said. "It'll launch next month." "Good," I replied. "Let the Avery name mean something again, even if it's not family." She smiled faintly, but her eyes betrayed something heavier. "You won, Mr. Avery," she said softly. "But at what cost?" I didn't answer. Some questions aren't meant to be solved, just lived with. As she left, I looked around the study one last time. The shelves were empty, the fireplace cold, the wedding portrait now turned toward the wall. I poured a glass of water, took a slow sip, and allowed myself one final thought. Can redemption rebuild what greed has destroyed? I didn't know, but at least now someone else would have the blueprints to try. The mornings at Lake Chelan are quiet in a way cities can't understand. The air carries the scent of pine and rain, and the water moves just enough to remind you that stillness isn't the same as silence. My cabin sits at the edge of it all, small, plain, unremarkable, the kind of place that asks for nothing and offers peace in return. I wake early now. Old habits, I suppose. I grind the beans by hand, the way I used to when Helen still read the paper at the table. The sound of the coffee grinder fills the room, soft and rhythmic, like a heart that finally beats for itself. I pour a cup and sit by the window, notebook open, pen waiting. The first line comes easily. I had to die a little, to live again. The words hang there, somewhere between confession and apology. They don't sting anymore. The pain has worn down to a kind of truth, dull but clean. Outside, the lake mirrors the sky, both gray and endless. There's something comforting about reflections. They lie less than people do. I think of them sometimes. Helen, Grace, Ethan. Not with anger. That faded the day I signed the new will. But with the strange calm that comes after a storm you survived. I used to believe betrayal was the end of love. Now I think it's just its last test. They thought they buried me in madness, but it was wisdom in disguise. The mail arrives mid-morning, 1 envelope, no return address. The handwriting stops me. I'd know it anywhere. Ethan's. Inside is an old photograph, the 4 of us standing outside the first house I ever built. The paint was fresh, my hair still dark, Helen's smile unguarded, Ethan's arms looped around my neck. On the back, he's written, "Thank you for teaching me what not to become." I don't cry. I just sit there, the picture trembling slightly between my fingers, as if the past were breathing through it. I place it on the windowsill where the light hits just right, the glass catching both the lake and the reflection of my own face. For a moment, the man in the water and the man in the room are the same. Older, quieter, but finally whole. Maybe justice isn't revenge, maybe it's survival. The kettle whistles softly in the background. A bird lands on the railing, curious but unafraid. I close the notebook, the last page still warm from my hand, and whisper to the empty room. That'll do. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching. May you and your family stay healthy, kind, and unbreakable. And don't miss the next story, one where truth and redemption meet again, somewhere unexpected.